Hey everybody, today's lecture we're going to talk about respiration. Earlier we had talked about the cardiovascular system and how one of the main things that it does is to transport oxygen throughout the body and to take CO2 away. And so we know that oxygen comes from the atmosphere, and so we need to get it from the air into our lungs. And then that CO2, when we say we take it away, we actually exhale it out of our lungs. So today's lecture, we're going to learn how we do that, how we actually breathe, right? So there's two related respirations. We already learned about the respiratory system, right? The one over here on the right. I'm sorry, the aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, this one over here. And so we learned how we use oxygen in order to convert glucose into ATP, right? So the point is we needed oxygen to do that. So we get oxygen again from the atmosphere. It's the autotrophs or the plants and some other organisms, but mainly our plants that release oxygen into the atmosphere. And so we use it in order to break glucose down to make energy, the ATP. Right? So we need our respiration system, our respiratory system, a series of tubes and sacs to be able to pull that oxygen out of the air and bring it down to where we can exchange it into our blood, into our cardiovascular system. Also remember that during respiration, mainly during the PrEP cycle and the citric acid cycle, that one of the waste products that was produced was carbon dioxide, CO2. And so that we said went back into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream then is going to bring it back to our lungs so we can exhale it out and put it back into the atmosphere. And then our plants like to use it. So sometimes we refer to cellular respiration as internal respiration, and breathing or respiration, our respiratory system, as external respiration. Okay, so again, it's this shows you a little bit nicer, this exchange of oxygen and CO2. That's what we're exchanging. We're exchanging the CO2, we want to get rid of it, in exchange for the oxygen. We want to bring it in. So this lecture is mainly going to talk about the steps of how we actually get air from the outside external environment, from the atmosphere, into our lungs, and then how we then exhale, how we then take that air from our lungs and exhale it out. Um, you might say, well, we just breathe, right? But how do we breathe? What's actually happening there? And you're going to see that this has to do with pressure gradients. Okay, the next lecture, we'll talk about the exchange of oxygen, how we put oxygen into our bloodstream, and how we take CO2 out, both at the lungs and then at the tissues. We're going to see how we put oxygen into our tissues and how then we get CO2 out. Okay. So you learned in anatomy, hopefully, all the respiratory airways, so it's helpful for you to remember what these airways are. We're mainly going to be concerned with the lungs, exactly what's happening at the lungs. But I do want to mention that while respiration, its primary job, its primary function as an organ system is to, again, bring oxygen into our lungs and exhale CO2 out. But there's actually many other functions of the respiratory system. Because if you recall that the tube system of tubes is lined by epithelial tissue, and that's a mucous membrane, and so it carries a lot of water with it. So it can also help control a little bit water loss. We mostly see this in other animals, like when your dog is panting. Remember, water carries heat, so it's also a way to remove heat. So dogs aren't the only ones that do it, but many other animals also do that as well. So it's because of that loss of water, they can also regulate heat. It also regulates venous return. So remember the respiratory pump that you learned about. It helps to maintain normal acid-base balance as well. Of course, it enables speech and things like singing and any other vocalizations and other organisms and the types of vocalizations they have. It can defend against foreign matter that we inhale. So if you recall from anatomy, I think we talked about how the mucous membranes can help trap uh, um, particles and things like that. And also we have some immunity cells to help defend against bacteria and viruses. Well, we know COVID-19 is a virus that travels in the respiratory system. So sometimes it doesn't always work the way we want it to. Sometimes a virus gets the better of us, right? And it can serve as an organ of smell. Remember at our nose here, we want to inhale air. And so the air also contains odor molecules. So then we have structures in our nose where we can sense what those odor molecules are. Okay, so actually a lot of functions of the respiratory system, but we're gonna look at, again, how we bring air into and out of our lungs. Okay. So, so here we're going deep into the lungs. Let me just so after our trachea branches into our bronchi to go to each lung, and then that branches into the smaller and smaller bronchioles until at the end we get to these alveolar sacs, right? And here we are with a close-up of the alveolar sacs. Recall that these are made of the alveolar sacs themselves are made out of simple squamous epithelial tissue, so one cell layer thick. And then each alveolus is covered by its own capillary bed. And remember, the cells of the capillary are also one cell layer thick. And those are actually really pressed together. They share a basement membrane. Remember that term from anatomy? So they share a basement membrane. So the diffusional distance between the inside of the alveolus to the inside of a capillary bed is the smallest distance we believe in our bodies. Okay, so that's a single layer of epithelial tissue. Those cells are referred to in the lungs as type 1 alveolar cells. And then there are also other cells associated with the alveoli. They're called type 2 alveolar cells, and they secrete a substance called a surfactant. And we're going to talk about surfactant later on in this lecture. Okay, I mentioned there are immune cells in there, so there are macrophages that kind of move around the inside space of the alveolus. Remember, space inside of an organ is called the lumen. So it kind of guards in there, kind of move around like amoeba through there. And then to help distribute the air that's coming in through the bronchioles as it enters the alveolar sac, we want to make sure that each alveolus gets filled up with as much air as possible. So there's actually little pores, little holes between alveoli that allows, so when one alveolus gets air, it can immediately inflate into the adjacent alveolus. So we get the maximum amount of air distributed throughout our lungs as possible. And then again, and then we have, the capillary bed is almost like a sheet of blood on the outside of our lungs. That's how many capillaries there are, so that we can get as much oxygen as possible. All right. The other thing I just want you to notice is that instead of the lungs being just one continuous flat sheet, having the structure of creating these little air sacs that are rounded, that actually creates more surface area. There's more space for air to go into than if it was just one flat sheet. So by our lungs being contained in our thoracic cavity, we're actually able to pack as much tissue in there as possible that can also facilitate gas exchange. So the amount of surface area we're going to see later is also very, very important as well. Okay. So our lungs, we have a pair of lungs. Saw that the bronchioles or bronchi branch into right and left, and that's so that it can conduct air into the right and left. So the two lungs are completely separate from one another within the pleural sacs. But then the lungs themselves are divided into lobes. And you remember you learned those lobes in anatomy. Let's see. So this is all contained within our thoracic cavity. So it's bounded by our chest wall or the ribs along both the anterior and lateral to the posterior side. But then on the bottom, the thoracic cavity is closed off by that big muscular muscle called the diaphragm. And I'll show you that in just a minute right here. So here you can see the diaphragm. That's that big sheet of a muscle that extends from the anterior side all the way to the posterior side and then all the way around. So this is totally the sheet of muscle completely blocks off the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity below. There is a hole in the middle just to allow for the aorta and the inferior vena cava to pass through that area, but it's pretty well sealed off. And then each lung itself is also sealed off by the pleural membranes, if you recall the pleural sacs that separate them. And those pleural membranes are going to be important as well. So I'll show you those in just a minute. It makes it a double wall, right? And this is actually what it looks like. So down in the lower picture here, this is just kind of a drawing of each lung. And then the blue is representing the membranes or the pleural membranes. So remember, there's one membrane that lays over the top of the lungs and it attaches to the lungs and it goes into all the cracks and crevices in each lobe. And so it sticks on there. And if you recall, that was the visceral pleural membrane. Ooh, almost forgot the visceral pleural membrane. And each lung has its own, right, separate. And then that tissue is continuous with an outer membrane. It kind of folds around, folds over and attaches to the diaphragm, and then folds around and attaches to the inner chest wall on the inside of the rib cage. And that is the parietal pleural membrane. And again, each side has its own. And so those membranes each contain the separate lungs on either side. Okay. So, and then in between the visceral and the pleural membrane, or the visceral and the parietal membranes, is fluid. So this is filled with a fluid. And what that fluid does is it allows the two membranes, remember, water is cohesive. So the two membranes want to stick to one another. And then because the parietal membrane sticks to the chest cavity along the inside, then these two pleural membranes will kind of pull and keep both our right and our left lungs inflated, keep them open. So when you exhale, you never squish all the air out of it. It never shrivels up into nothing. You actually, when you exhale, the lungs kind of remain in an open state, okay? And I'll explain in just a minute also why that is important and how that happens. Diaphragm below, you've got your parietal pleural membrane, you've got your visceral pleural membrane, and then your lungs inside of there. So this picture above just kind of shows you when I mentioned that the visceral membrane kind of folds outward and then forms the parietal membrane, and it's a continuous piece of tissue with fluid in the middle. So this kind of demonstrates that. If you took a lollipop, something round, and you took a water-filled balloon, okay, and you press the lollipop into that balloon, you would have a part of the membrane of the balloon that touches the lollipop. Okay, and the water would squish around it. And then you would have the outer membrane of the balloon that kind of also wraps around. It continues to wrap around, but that part isn't touching the lollipop, right? And so this is showing you how that parietal membrane comes around and then is continuous with the visceral membrane. It's the visceral membrane that adheres to the lollipop, or now in this case, we're calling it the lung. So this in the middle then is the pleural sac where it sits inside there. So again, this would be the fluid inside of it. We might refer to it as the intrapleural fluid. Intra, so remember, intra means inside, intrapleural fluid. Okay. So let's look a little bit more at how these two tissues interact with one another and how it's going to affect the function of the lungs. Okay, so there's actually three different pressures that are interacting with this structure of our lungs. Okay, so so now we're talking about gas pressures. In previous lectures, we were talking about fluid pressures, but now a gas actually exerts pressure as well, because remember that gases are also made of molecules and they're bouncing around and bouncing off each other. And so out in the atmosphere here, there is a pressure, we call it atmospheric pressure, or sometimes you might hear the meteorologists on TV calling it the barometric pressure. And so that has more space, right? So there's more space for these molecules of gases to move around and bounce off of each other and bounce off of you, right? And so that does it at a certain amount of pressure as it bounces off of you. And that's called atmospheric pressure, okay? Atmospheric pressure. So when you hear, at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. That means you have all this pressure, all this gas above you, all the way to space, right? All of that is actually pressing down at you at 760 millimeters of mercury. We don't really feel that. We're acclimated to that, right? But when you go to the high mountains, there's less air above you, right? And you've left some of that air below you. So that means that's less pressure pushing on you. So you might, depending on how high at every elevation, it's less and less pressure. And so depending on how high you go, there's less pressure. And so therefore you might say, the pressure at elevation, depending on where you are, is 700 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and so on and so forth. So we're going to talk more about that. So that's atmospheric pressure. Then there's pressure inside of your lungs. Remember, I mentioned inside of your lungs, because of the interaction of the pleural membranes, your lungs stay open. They don't collapse down. So because they stay open, there's always some air in there. And so that's the intrapulmonary pressure. So again, within intrapulmonary, your lungs pressure. Okay, in some textbooks, they might refer to it as intra-alveolar pressure. Well, it's the same thing. Your alveoli are the little structures that together make up your lungs. Okay, so it's the air pressure inside of your lungs. Okay, and then in between those two pleural membranes, right here, there is a pressure inside of there because of the fluids. Okay, so there's a pressure there. That's called the intrapleural pressure. So the pressure between the pleural membranes. Pleural means membranes. Okay. Sometimes, again, some sources refer to that as intrathoracic pressure. It can also be considered the pressure in your thoracic cavity outside of your lungs, right? All the pressure outside of your lungs, and that's the space between these membranes. Okay, so we got to keep these definitions in mind, because these pressures are really important in ventilation of whether you're going to inhale or whether you're going to exhale. It's all about pressure differences. We humans produce what's called a negative pressure inside of our lungs. We produce a negative pressure so that in order to inhale, and what we're doing is we're decreasing the pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure. We're decreasing that pressure so that it's lower than atmospheric pressure. Okay, and if we do that, air is going to come in. Then if we can increase the pressure inside of our lungs compared to atmospheric pressure, we will end up exhaling. Okay, so here this picture is showing you if we were at rest, okay, this would be like your trachea and your bronchioles and everything. It's all representing that collectively. So the space where air is going to travel into your lungs. Okay, and then you can again see the distribution of the membranes as well. Okay, well, we said atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, you probably just want to remember that. It'll come up a lot, and it's an easy one to remember. Okay, so that's always 760 millimeters of mercury. Well, at rest, when you're not inhaling or exhaling, it's at equilibrium. Inside of your lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. But look at this one. The intrapleural pressure is always lower than the intrapulmonary pressure. At rest, it's at 756. 756 millimeters of mercury. So that's just lower. What that means is, this is when I told you your lungs never fully collapse. That's because there's a pressure gradient from the intrapulmonary pressure inside your lungs to the intrapleural pressure, the space just outside of your lungs. There's always a gradient that it's higher in the lungs, lower outside of the lungs. Therefore, that pressure, again, always wants to expand outward, okay, from inside to out. And therefore, the air can't escape, but the gas wants to go that way. So it puts pressure on that visceral membrane and it pushes the lungs outward. And therefore, your lungs always take on the shape of your thoracic cavity, okay, and they always remain open. Now, what we're going to see in order to inhale, we're going to manipulate this pressure inside the lungs. This one is also going to change, but it's going to always be lower than the lung pressure. It is always lower than the lung pressure. Okay. And therefore, it's always, the lungs are always going to expand. All righty. When we exhale, again, we're going to manipulate this pressure. We're going to raise it. This pressure will change too, but it's always going to be lower than this pressure. So again, that's why your lungs never collapse. Okay, there's always a pressure gradient between the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure. Okay, so let's go on and let's see how this works. This idea is from Boyle's law. So you may have learned about Boyle's law in chemistry. Boyle's law tells us, so we're just assuming that the temperature is constant, it pretty much is in our bodies, right? That the pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to the volume of the gas, right? So we have that written down here for you in mathematical. So the pressure of the gas is equal to 1 over volume. That means it's an inverse proportion. That means when the volume gets bigger, the pressure is lower. When the volume is smaller, the pressure is higher, right? You can throw a number in there. So we can do a 2. The volume is 2, that's 1/2. Okay, so that means the pressure is 1/2, right? If I put a 3 here for volume, that makes the pressure 1/3. If I put a 4 here for volume, that makes the pressure 1/4. You can see that every time I raise the number on volume, I go 2, 3, 4, the pressure is going 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. It's going down, okay? And what that means is that has to do with the space inside of a container. So if we look at this middle one, this container B, and we start with a volume inside of there, the volume doesn't really matter at this point, but it's constant right now. And these little circles, I'm pausing when I see my internet is unstable, so I'll keep doing that. So these little circles represent gas, air molecules bouncing off one another, and they're bouncing off the walls of the container. So because they're bouncing off one another, that produces a pressure. Okay, and this little gauge is telling us the pressure right now is 1. Okay, well, what happens if we increase the volume? Okay, but we haven't, at this point, we're not changing the amount of gas in there. All we're doing is increasing the volume. So with the higher volume, there's more space. And you can see now it takes longer for these air molecules to move across to hit each other. So because it takes longer, there's less collisions. Less collisions translate to less pressure. You can see the pressure went down. The arrow's going this way now. It was going up. Now it's going off to the left. So that means the pressure is lowering. Okay, and all we did was open the volume. On the other side, you can take the volume and squish it down. So now we have less volume over here. Okay, now because there's less space inside of there, the air molecules come into contact with each other more frequently, and they're constantly bouncing off each other in the walls. That is an increase in pressure, okay, because they're bouncing off one another more frequently. So that translates as an increase in pressure. All right, I thought we were talking about lungs. Well, we are. So what you're going to do, remember I mentioned that we're going to manipulate the pressure inside of our thoracic cavity, inside of our lungs. Well, how do we do that? We're going to make this, we want to lower the pressure, right? We want to make the space inside of the lungs less than atmospheric pressure. Okay, how do we do that? Well, if we can make the volume of the lung bigger, just like here, then there'd be a pressure gradient. And that higher pressure from the atmosphere, if we open our mouth and open the passageways in our lungs, if we do that, air is going to move in. That's what you're doing when you inhale. So you're actually just using your muscles in your thoracic cavity to make the thoracic cavity bigger. So you've decreased the pressure inside of your lungs, and it's lower. As long as it's lower than the atmospheric pressure, air is going to come in. Okay, that's inhalation. Then we're going to see if we make the pressure, the space, the volume in our lungs smaller, then that's going to increase the pressure in our lungs. It's going to be higher than atmospheric pressure, and then air is going to move out. All the while we do that, when we manipulate the space in our lungs, remember that the intrapleural pressure, no matter what, will always be less than this pressure. It's going to change along with the pressure in our lungs, but it's always going to be lower. So that way, again, you never completely collapse your lungs. Okay, so it's very important to remember Boyle's law, pressure is 1 over volume, because we're using the principle of Boyle's law in order to inhale and exhale. And that principle is we're changing the volume. We change the volume and the pressure follows. Okay, I'm going to say that again because it's really important. We change the volume of our thoracic cavity, okay, in order to change the pressure. Okay, and then we change pressure gradients compared to the atmosphere. And that's going to dictate whether we inhale or we exhale. Okay, I'll go on and show you more about that. So again, if you increase the volume inside the thoracic cavity, then you end up decreasing the pressure inside of the cavity. So now we have to figure out, how do we do that? How do we change the volume of our thoracic cavity? And remember, because our lungs are attached to the inside of our thoracic cavity, when we change the volume of our thoracic cavity, we also change the volume of the lungs. We pull on the lungs. Okay, so how do we do that? We do that with 2 major muscles. Okay, the diaphragm, the one I just showed you, and the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so let me show you the diaphragm first. This is regarding restful breathing. Hopefully what you're doing right now, unless you're watching this lecture while you're on a treadmill or something, then we're going to engage other muscles. But during restful breathing, we're really just engaging the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. So I'm going to pause the video for just a moment so I can start it up again and show you this diaphragm demonstration so you can see the movement of the diaphragm to understand this. Okay. Oop. There we go. Okay, so here we are, and I'm back with an animation to show you. So now we're looking into a person's chest. You can see the ribs, right, that form the boundaries of the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity is within the ribs with the sternum in front, the vertebrae in the back. And then here, this shadow here, this dome shaped thing, that's the diaphragm. And so when I start this animation, you can see that the diaphragm is raising and lowering. When it raises up, the volume inside of the thoracic cavity decreases. When it goes down, the volume increases. Here it is, decrease, increase. Okay, now here's also what's important. When you contract your diaphragm, that means you're pulling it downward. Okay, when you contract, I'm going to go back again so you can see that. When you contract your diaphragm, that means you pull it downward. You're relaxing it. Okay, when your diaphragm relaxes, it bows upward. So exhalation occurs when you relax your diaphragm and your diaphragm goes upward. And it's an exhalation because you can see the volume in the thoracic, the thoracic cavity or inside the lungs too, is getting smaller. When volume goes down, pressure goes up. So we have open airways. Air is going to move from the area of high pressure in the lungs to low pressure in the atmosphere. Okay. When we contract the diaphragm, which is what you're seeing now, the diaphragm is moving downward, right? There, it's contracting. That opened up the volume in our lungs. So the pressure is going down and it's lower than atmospheric pressure. So the air is moving in from high pressure to low pressure. So it's also very important for you to remember that when you contract your diaphragm, that means it's pulling downward. Remember, muscle can only pull, and that's the same as your diaphragm. So it's pulling downward. Okay. Okay. And then when it's moving upward, it's because you're relaxing it. So inhalation takes energy. You expend energy in a contraction pulling it downward. Exhalation at rest doesn't take energy. You're just allowing your muscle to recoil back to its original shape. Okay. So you might want to, on the PowerPoint slide that's posted, this link is provided on there so you can watch this animation as many times as you want to. Right? Very muscular guy. Okay, I'm gonna pause one more time so that I can. Okay, so you just saw the activity of the diaphragm, how that works to manipulate the volume inside of our thoracic cavity, or another way to say it is to manipulate the intrapulmonary volume or the intraalveolar volume, right? So when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls downward, that increases volume, which decreases pressure, and we inhale. When the diaphragm relaxes, then it goes back up. That decreases volume, which increases pressure in the lungs, and we exhale. Okay. Now, let me remind you of the external intercostals because those also help. And all of this, again, is stimulated by your nerves. So the phrenic nerve comes from your brainstem, and you have an unconscious ability to inhale and exhale. You don't have to think about it. We also have nerves called intercostal nerves. Those also are stimulated automatically as well. Okay, whoops, there we go. So here's just a reminder, the intercostal muscles are the ones in between your ribs, right? Costal refers to ribs, so inter, between the ribs. And the muscles on the outside are called the external intercostals. You also have a layer of muscle along the inside underneath that. You can see it, you look between the ribs here. You have internal intercostals, okay? But they do different things. The external intercostals, when those contract, that actually opens up your rib cage. It causes your rib cage to expand outward, okay? It kind of pulls everything and it expands it outward. So if they expand outward, what's happening to the volume, you can see between my hands, it's getting bigger. So that's happening at the same time the diaphragm is pulling down. And so the volume is getting bigger. What happens to pressure? It goes down. So that's an inhalation. Pressure will be lower than atmospheric pressure. Okay. And so remember, we've got the intrapleural pressure within the membrane. Okay, right there. That's when we inhale. So when we pull our diaphragm down and we pull our intercostal, our ribs outward, that's going to cause our intrapleural pressure to go up, right? It's also going to cause our, I have my, I'm going to pause this. I have my arrows backwards. Hang on. Okay, I fixed it. This is what I was trying to say. So we're still in inspiration or inhalation, the same thing. So again, you're imagining we're contracting our inspiratory muscles. That was the diaphragm, it pulls down. Our intercostal muscles pull out. So the volume in our, is gonna change inside of our thoracic cavity. Everything's getting bigger. Okay, so even I mentioned the intrapleural pressure changes, that's gonna go down because bigger volume means less pressure, okay? That also means, because we're pulling our lungs out, right? And that's gonna cause the intrapulmonary pressure or the volume in the lungs to go down as well, okay? Before I show you that, again, remember, as long as the intrapleural pressure is always lower than the intrapulmonary pressure, our lungs stay expanded, okay? So that's lower than atmospheric pressure when we reduce the pressure in the lungs. And when it is lower than atmospheric pressure, then inhalation occurs, okay? So again, it starts with the muscles, increasing the volume, which decreases the pressure. And as long as it's lower than atmospheric pressure, we inhale. Okay, this about the intrapleural pressure just has to do with keeping our lungs expanded, okay, so that they never collapse. This is really important. Okay, now what about expiration? So again, when you're relaxing and you're just doing normal breathing, then we don't require any extra muscle activity. And so we do that by just relaxing your diaphragm. It's going to go up, right? Relaxing the external intercostals, that allows the thoracic cage to come down this way. So all of that, we're making the volume smaller. So that's going to increase pressure. Volume goes down, pressure goes up, and air is going to move out. Okay, but when we do that, we're still manipulating the intrapleural pressure, because remember that this membrane is attached to the thoracic cavity. So when our lungs come back smaller, it also makes the intrapleural pressure, the volume, go down there. So it's also, I can't make it go. There we go. It's going to increase. The volume goes down, so the pressure increases. Okay. The intrapulmonary pressure, the volume inside of there is going to go down. So that means the pressure is also going to increase. Right? And then it becomes higher than atmospheric pressure and it's going to leave. I didn't change those numbers. You've got to imagine those numbers are changing. Okay. But the fact that the intrapleural pressure is still lower than the intrapulmonary pressure, remember that, so that when our lung volume starts to decrease, it never collapses. They always are held open because of this pressure difference. Intrapleural is always lower than intrapulmonary. Very important to remember that. And the reason, so think about if you had a pneumothorax, right? A pneumothorax is when there's a tear in the tissues. Okay, it's really a tear in the pleural membranes. Okay, your lungs can still be intact, but if there's a tear in the pleural membranes, then that means this air from other areas of the body comes in. And this pressure increases in the intrapleural membrane so that it's higher than what's in the lungs. And what happens? Your lung collapses. That's what a collapsed lung is from a pneumothorax. How do you get a pneumothorax? Well, something terrible, something can stab you, right? And stab you in there. Hopefully it's not a person doing that. You can break a rib, and a rib can actually stab through the pleural membrane. That'll give you a pneumothorax. Sometimes people moving wrong. I learned about this years ago. Usually very large men, if you're just very big, you're tall, you're just and just big men, there might be kind of a natural limit to how big people can get, because very tall men report that. Just one woman told me one year her husband was painting the house and he was stretching and painting the house and he just went, and he felt something and it didn't feel right. And then all of a sudden he couldn't breathe as well. And so what he did is that stretch, he tore the pleural membrane, causing a pneumothorax. The good thing is, let me go back. Remember, I said our membranes our pleural sacs are separate for each one. So if you have one collapsed lung, as long as you didn't tear the membrane on the other side, your other lung will keep functioning. It's still uncomfortable. You're breathing at 50%, right? But you're breathing. You're still getting enough air, and you can get to the doctor's office, and they can fix it. So that's epithelial tissue in the pleural membrane. So it does grow back. You just have to not move for a while. They'll probably keep you in the hospital for a few days and monitor that growth and the repair that occurs. And then what it does, your lungs will reinflate. That pressure gradient will start to manipulate itself. And so they test your lung capacity, which we'll look at a little bit in just a little bit later. Okay, so this slide, a very nice slide that kind of shows you the difference in the action of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So again, the external intercostal muscles are the ones we're talking about for restful inhalation. Okay, so here you can kind of look at this and see what happens between inhalation and exhalation. Okay. And there's a nice, I like this picture of the X-ray picture, because here it shows you when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's poking upward into the thoracic cavity. And here you can see the volume. This is your heart in the middle. You can see the volume of the lungs is smaller compared to here. When your diaphragm is contracted, it's pulled down. Okay, and now the volume of the lungs is bigger. So volume's bigger, pressure is smaller, air comes in, inspiration. Here, volume is smaller, pressure is higher, air goes out. That's expiration. Okay, make sure it's easy for students to flip that around. So if you understand the activity of the muscles and you really understand Boyle's law, then you should be able to reason this out. Okay. One other thing I did want to mention before I move on to the next portion is that for forceful inhalation and exhalation, with forceful inhalation and exhalation, excuse me, I can't say that properly, we actually enlist other muscles, right? So with quiet breathing or restful breathing, again, diaphragm, external intercostals, and then those just relax when you're exhaling. But during forceful breathing, when you want to inhale and you really want to pull up the rib cage, you can engage your sternocleidomastoid muscles. Remember those from anatomy? And they kind of pull up on the clavicle, right? And on the sternum, and that helps to increase along with the diaphragm and the external intercostals, that makes this volume inside here even bigger, okay? The scalenes also can help. Everything that can help outside pull that rib cage open even more. Okay, forceful exhalation, when you do that, you engage the internal intercostal muscles, because that's going to really squish down the rib cage, again, making the volume even smaller, and the pressure goes up even higher and more air goes out. You also engage your rectus abdominis muscles. Remember the ones on the front? You can't see me, especially the ones on your abdomen. And think about that when you're exercising and your trainer says they want you to really exhale when you're doing a sit-up, right? They're saying that because in order to exhale, you have to contract your abdominal muscles really hard, right? In order to do a forceful exhale. So contracting the abdominal muscles kind of makes you to bend forward. And then what that does is that also makes your thoracic cavity even smaller. Okay, now we're going to kind of look at what's going on inside of the lungs and what also might affect air flowing in and out. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video here so that we can do this video in 2 parts. All right, see you in a minute.